They were called the Anunnaki, divine beings whose names were pressed into clay thousands of years before the rise of Greece, Rome, or the biblical kingdoms. They ruled from the heavens. They governed the earth. They judged kings, controlled destinies, and stood at the center of humanity's oldest surviving civilizations. But beneath the temples and sacred hymns lies a more unsettling story. A story of gods burdened by labor, of rebellion among divine workers, of blood spilled in a secret chamber, and of a new creature fashioned to carry the burden the gods no longer wished to bear. That creature was humanity. But who were the Anunnaki? Why did the ancient Mesopotamians believe they came to Earth? And why, according to their oldest traditions, did the gods eventually place their work into human hands? This is the story preserved in clay, the story of the Anunnaki. The civilization we call Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, people constructed some of humanity's earliest cities: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur. Across the plains rose enormous stepped temples known as ziggurats. These structures were more than places of worship. They were believed to be meeting points between the human world and the divine realm. At the center of this sacred order stood a vast family of gods. Among them were the Anunnaki. The precise meaning of their name remains debated, but it is commonly connected to Anu, the supreme god of the heavens. They were, in essence, the descendants or princely offspring of Anu, those who carried divine authority. They were not described as a single race performing one simple task. In different texts and different periods, the Anunnaki appear as a powerful assembly of deities. Some were associated with the heavens. Others governed the earth. Still others became judges in the shadowed world beneath it. Their number was never completely fixed. Neither was their role. Mesopotamian religion changed across thousands of years, and the gods changed with it. Yet the Anunnaki remained symbols of the oldest divine order, an order that existed before human kings claimed their thrones. At its summit stood Anu, Lord of the highest heaven. Beside him stood Enlil, master of wind, storms, and royal authority. And beneath the fresh waters of the earth stood Enki, god of wisdom, creation, magic, and hidden knowledge. Together, these gods shaped the world imagined by ancient Mesopotamia. But their world was not peaceful. It was governed by rank, obligation, and labor. Even the gods were expected to work. In Mesopotamian thought, the universe operated like a kingdom. Every god held a position. Every force of nature had a ruler. Every city belonged to a divine patron. The heavens were governed by Anu. The atmosphere and the inhabited world were placed under Enlil. The subterranean waters known as the Abzu belonged to Enki. These were not distant gods who merely watched humanity from above. They were believed to inhabit temples, receive food, wear garments, and take part in the affairs of kings and cities. Humans served them through ritual. Priests carried offerings into their sanctuaries. Musicians performed sacred hymns. Farmers produced grain for temple estates. Kings claimed to rule with divine approval. But ancient texts describe an age before humanity performed these duties, an age when the gods themselves carried the burden of maintaining the world. Canals had to be dug, riverbanks had to be controlled, fields had to be prepared, the land had to be made fertile. According to the Babylonian poem known as Atrahasis, this exhausting labor was assigned to a group of junior deities commonly called the Igigi. While the higher gods governed, the Igigi worked. They dug through the soil. They opened waterways. They maintained the system upon which divine society depended. For hundreds of years they endured the burden, until the burden became unbearable. The work was relentless. The labor was crushing. The Igigi had grown weary of serving the higher gods. Then, one night, they rose in rebellion. They gathered their tools, they surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, and they set their work equipment on fire. The divine laborers refused to continue. The gods had reached a crisis. The world still required maintenance. The canals still had to flow. The fields still had to produce. But the workers would no longer obey. Enlil demanded to know who had led the rebellion. Yet the Igigi stood together. Their defiance was shared. Their suffering was shared. Punishing one would not solve the problem. The divine system itself had failed. The higher gods required a new source of labor, one that would work in place of the rebellious gods. Enki, the god of wisdom, offered a solution. A new being would be created. It would possess enough intelligence to understand commands, enough strength to cultivate the earth, enough endurance to continue across generations. This being would take upon itself the work of the gods. The gods would be released from their burden, and humanity would enter the world. The creation of humanity was not presented as a gentle miracle. It was an act of divine necessity. According to Atrahasis, the gods summoned the birth goddess. She is identified in different traditions by names such as Mami, Nintu, and Belet Ili. The gods instructed her to create a worker, a creature capable of carrying the divine load. But clay alone was not enough. The new being required a divine element. One of the gods would have to die. A deity sometimes named Wei-Ilu, or Gesh-Tue in other readings, was selected and killed. His flesh and blood were mixed with clay. The birth goddess shaped the mixture. Enki directed the ritual. From the clay of the earth and the blood of a god, humanity was formed. This mixture explains the divided nature of human beings within the myth. Humanity was mortal because it came from clay, yet humanity possessed intelligence, consciousness, and restless ambition because something divine existed within it. The new creatures were not created to rule. They were created to work. They would dig the canals. They would cultivate the fields. They would raise animals. They would build temples. They would prepare offerings. Humanity would sustain the world of the gods. The rebellion of the Igigi had ended. The burden had been transferred. In later religious traditions, humanity is often described as the center of creation. But the Mesopotamian texts present a more difficult vision. Human beings were created because the gods required relief. Their purpose was service. The temples were considered divine households. The statue of a god was washed, dressed, fed, and honored. Food offerings were placed before the divine image. The gods were praised through music and ceremony. Around these temples grew powerful institutions controlling land, livestock, labor, and trade. What began in myth became reflected in society. Just as humanity worked for the gods, ordinary people worked under kings, priests, and temple administrators. The structure of heaven mirrored the structure of earth. The gods ruled above. Kings ruled below. Workers sustained both. The creation story, therefore, did more than explain where humanity came from. It explained why labor existed, why temples received offerings, why kings possessed authority, and why society was arranged as a hierarchy. To serve the divine order was to preserve civilization itself. But humanity did not remain a quiet and obedient workforce. People multiplied. Cities expanded. The noise of civilization rose across the land. And once again, the gods became disturbed. According to Atrahasis, the human population grew rapidly. Their voices filled the earth. Their activity became relentless. Enlil could no longer rest. The very beings created to solve the gods' problem had become a new problem of their own. Enlil attempted to reduce humanity through plague, but Enki, who had helped create humankind, warned his human servant. The people survived. Enlil then sent drought. Again, Enki intervened. Famine followed. Once more, humanity endured. Finally, Enlil decided upon total destruction. A flood would sweep across the world. The human workforce would be erased. But Enki refused to abandon his creation. He warned a man named Atrahasis. In another Mesopotamian tradition, this survivor would be called Utnapishtim. Enki instructed him to construct a vessel. His household, animals, and essential forms of life were brought aboard. Then the storm came. The waters rose. The land disappeared beneath the flood. Even the gods were shaken by the destruction. And when the waters receded, the survivor offered a sacrifice. The gods gathered around the offering. Only then did they realize the consequence of eliminating humanity. Without humans, there were no fields, no temples, no offerings. No one remained to perform the labor. Humanity had been created to serve the gods, but the gods had also become dependent upon humanity. A new agreement was established. Humans would survive, but mortality, disease, infertility, and limits upon childbirth would restrain their numbers. The partnership between gods and humanity continued, not as equals, but as two parts of a system neither could easily abandon. In modern popular culture, the Anunnaki are often described as extraterrestrial visitors. According to this interpretation, they traveled to Earth from a distant planet, sometimes called Nibiru, in search of gold. Human beings were then allegedly engineered as a slave species to mine the planet's resources. It is a powerful story. It combines ancient mystery, lost technology, genetic manipulation, and humanity's deepest questions about its origins. But this version does not appear in the surviving Mesopotamian creation texts. The clay tablets do describe gods. They describe divine labor. They describe rebellion. They describe humanity being created to take over that labor. But they do not state that the Anunnaki arrived in spacecraft to mine gold, and Nibiru was not consistently described as a hidden planet inhabited by extraterrestrials. In Babylonian astronomy, the word could refer to a crossing point or to a celestial body associated with the god Marduk. The extraterrestrial interpretation is modern. It emerged from 20th century attempts to read ancient mythology as misunderstood technological history. Supporters argue that words such as heaven, descent, and divine knowledge may conceal memories of visitors from another world. Historians and specialists in cuneiform texts reject those translations, pointing instead to the religious, political, and symbolic world of Mesopotamia. The distinction matters. Ancient text and modern theory are not the same thing, yet the popularity of the theory reveals something important. The original story already contains the elements that continue to fascinate us. Powerful beings descending from the heavens. Humanity formed through a deliberate process, a divine substance placed within earthly material, and a new species created to perform labor for its makers. The ancient tablets do not need spaceships to be extraordinary. Their vision of humanity is unsettling enough on its own. The central moment in the story is not the arrival of the gods. It is the transfer of responsibility. At first, the divine workers shaped the land. They dug the canals. They controlled the waters. They maintained the world. Then the workers rebelled. The higher gods responded not by ending the labor, but by creating someone else to perform it. Humanity inherited the tools. Humanity entered the fields. Humanity built the cities. Humanity raised the temples. The gods withdrew from physical labor and became rulers, judges, and recipients of sacrifice. Their work had been handed down. This may be the true meaning behind the ancient story. Civilization required endless effort. Someone had to clear the land. Someone had to control the rivers. Someone had to produce food. Someone had to build the walls, protecting the city. The myth transformed that human struggle into a cosmic event. Work was not merely a condition of society. It was the reason humanity existed. But humanity did more than carry the burden. People created writing. They charted the heavens. They developed mathematics, law, architecture, and literature. The workers became creators. The beings fashioned to serve the divine order began shaping the world themselves. And perhaps that was the part the gods never anticipated. The Anunnaki were among the most powerful figures in ancient Mesopotamian religion. They belonged to the divine family of Anu. They participated in the government of heaven, earth, and the underworld. They represented authority, judgment, and the sacred order behind civilization. In the ancient texts, they were not simply visitors arriving for a single mission. Their story formed part of a much larger religious universe. And within that universe, humanity was created after a crisis among the gods. The divine laborers rebelled. The higher gods required a replacement. Clay was mixed with divine blood. A new species opened its eyes. Human beings inherited the work. Whether understood as sacred mythology, political symbolism, or a distant memory transformed across generations, the story leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Were humans created because we were loved? Or because we were useful? The clay tablets cannot answer every mystery surrounding the Anunnaki, but they preserve something even more enduring than a tale of gods descending from the sky. They preserve humanity's earliest attempt to understand why we are here, why we labor, why we build, why we serve, and why, despite being born to carry the burden of the gods, humanity has never stopped reaching toward the heavens. The Anunnaki may have handed their labor to humanity, but the civilization humanity created would eventually transform the gods themselves. Their names would change, their stories would be rewritten, and from their ancient world would rise new kingdoms, new religions, and new visions of creation. Subscribe to Lorevia Echoes as we continue uncovering the forgotten stories buried beneath history. Because every legend leaves an echo, and every echo leads us closer to the truth.